IVM.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project.
We have as our guest today Mark Hannant. Mark is a creative services entrepreneur and the author of Midnight's Grandchildren, which we discuss in the first half of the podcast.
In the second half, we discuss Sophie Grigson's Fish, Haruki Murakami's A Wild Sheep Chase, and the best of A.W. Wainwright. Happy listening.
Some of India's urban millennials increasingly conform to the stereotype that, like their international peers, they spend their time in cars they've booked on Uber, travelling to meet people they've hooked up with on Tinder, to Netflix and chill. And when they're done with that, they'll order take-out food via a delivery app and transact using a mobile-enabled payment wallet. The platforms may change between regions, but similar stories are being played out in Miami, Munich, Mombasa and Melbourne. What is uniquely Indian is the ease with which they manage that chance of instant gratification without turning their back on tradition. Many are comfortable to hook up with someone they met on Tinder on a Friday night and then see an arranged marriage boy introduced through a family connection and pre-approved by the parents on a Saturday. Step into a branch of Cafe Coffee Day in any Indian city on a Saturday afternoon and you'll find dozens of such meetings. Coffee is, of course, peripheral to the experience. Indian millennials seem open to finding a life partner through either route and will keep their options open. In reality, Tinder is just a modern version of what's been going on for centuries in India, where the passing around of biodata, including details of birth time, alignment of the stars, height, weight, caste origins, parental employment, and even skin tone, is standard practice. In the past, there would have been paper versions and even column inches in the matrimonial section of a newspaper. Then came websites such as Shadi.com, and now the same information buzzes through a messaging service and does the rounds of friendship groups. Rejected by one, passed on to another. So the principle of swiping one way or the other is not new. Technology is disrupting the age-old dynamic because it puts the swipe firmly in the hands of young people and allows them to circumvent the prying eyes of parents and a battalion of aunties whose most important mission in life is matchmaking. These changes are being reflected in popular culture. The mobile phone lets boys and girls, men and women speak to each other in ways not previously possible, and to individuals not previously known. It has been a great enabler and disruptor on many levels. The ubiquity of the mobile phone sparked a fad of pop songs in local languages. Many were themed around the missed call, a trope in modern India that signifies a host of new opportunities. In the Hindi pop song of that name, we hear from a woman's perspective the anticipation and delight in finding out who her secret admirer is. In advertising, it's morphed into an active customer engagement tool. Give us a missed call and we'll get back to you, say several brands.
Thank you, Mark Hannant. That was an extract from his book, Midnight's Grandchildren, How Young Indians Are Disrupting the World's Largest Democracy. We'll be right back after this to discuss the book in more detail.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Welcome to Paperback by the Open Library Project. I am your co-host Satyajit, otherwise known as Onion Knight in most food circles. I'm hosting this podcast with my co-founder at the Open Library Project, Racheta Sharma.
Hi guys, my name is Racheta. I'm an ex-banker, social impact entrepreneur, podcaster, writer, publisher, and inveterate learner. The Open Library Project is a curated library service which is offered to corporates on a subscription basis. The idea here is to create value, build a knowledge community, and encourage a growth mindset amongst our members.
Today we have with us on the show Mark Hannant. Mark is an entrepreneur who works in creative services. He moved with his wife and young children from London to Mumbai more than a decade ago. He is the author of Midnight's Grandchildren, How Young Indians Are Disrupting the World's Largest Democracy. And he has also appeared in 2 Bollywood movies. Hey, welcome to the show, Mark.
It's lovely to have you
It's a pleasure
here.
to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
So many questions. So one, I love London. It's one of my favorite cities. So I'm really eager to know about, your life there and when you decided to move and come to India and your choices, and also about the Bollywood movies.
Okay, so we start with the Bollywood movies,
Yeah.
shall we? So I have appeared in 2 movies, one of which was a film called Hawaizada,
Okay.
which
Oh, right.
starred Ayushmann Khurrana and a very good friend of mine called Pallavi Sharda. And I think what happened was that there was some production meeting one morning and they said, we need a middle-aged white guy to play the part of the Viceroy.
Okay.
And I think Pallavi said, I know one of those. So I got a phone call, and then the next thing I knew, I was playing the role of Lord Victor Bruce, who was the Viceroy to India.
Wow.
So that was quite fun. And then subsequently, I played the part of a character called Sir Claude Auchinleck, who was the most senior British soldier in India just before independence. And he was a participant in what were called the Red Fort trials that were held in New Delhi, and were essentially around, the formation of the Indian National Army.
Right.
So I played 2 historical characters, obviously both baddies. And I found that very interesting. It gave me an insight into a world that I don't normally engage with, so I found that quite fascinating. And obviously in Mumbai, Bollywood is a really key industry. It employs many people and it generates a lot of income and wealth for people. So
Absolutely.
to have an opportunity to kind of get an insight into that was fun.
Fantastic. Sounds
Yeah.
fascinating. I think we as
Amazing.
like local Bombay people don't have as much as an insight, even though we live here, because it's kind of a closely guarded community. You don't get to know the inner workings of the film industry unless you're really involved.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's fascinating when you get that opportunity and you get a kind of glimpse inside it. And not, you're a participant in it. So it's not
Right.
like you're turning up as a journalist and they're
Right,
giving
right.
you some sort of sanitized version of
Right.
it. You get to see it, the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
the real version of it.
But in answer to your question, I didn't come to India in order to be to be in Bollywood films. That was just a sort of happy happenstance, if you will. So I had a great life in London, which you're right is a fantastic city.
Yeah, it's just full of life.
It's full of life, it's got beautiful architecture, it's got
Right.
fantastic music venues, theatres, brilliant restaurants, a lot of great people. And, it's a magnet and it attracts particularly kind of creative talent from around the world. And I'd had a successful career in London for, a decade and a half. But this was in 2008. So, you've got the backdrop of a global economic crisis.
Right.
And I had a sense that, the real action was taking place in other parts of the world, particularly in large, fast-growing markets such as China and India. And I felt that there was an opportunity perhaps to spend the second half of my career using some of the skills that I developed in London and, working with some global clients to come and see if there was an opportunity to utilize some of those skills in India. So I saw a business opportunity, fast-growing, exciting, dynamic market. But I also have a familial connection in the sense that my wife is Gujarati, so I have 2 half Indian children, and I thought that it would be advantageous to them to come and spend some time and to know their Indian-born cousins and to learn to speak Indian languages. And we've been successful on that level.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. And they get best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Or the worst of both. I think so I have a 12-year-old daughter. I think at the moment feels like I've done her some terrible injustice and robbed her of a life of luxury in London. Right. Of course, the opposite is actually true. But, when you're a 12-year-old, you don't see things.
You don't have that perspective yet.
No, I hope that at some point later in life she will
Yeah.
recognise the fact that they've had the best of both worlds.
Right.
Right. So tell us about how you got into writing. You moved to Bombay, and now you've written a book about Indian entrepreneurs.
Actually, the book is about India's millennials.
India's
so that
millennials,
generation
okay.
of young people who are, who now make up 50% of the workforce and are obviously the sort of key consumer group.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my background, I the early part of my professional life was as a business journalist. So I've written throughout my professional life. I now run, we have a couple of businesses that we would describe as creative services.
Okay.
And so I spend less of my time writing and more of my time sort of, managing projects for clients.
Right.
But I still like to keep my hand in. The backstory is this. I gave a presentation in London about 4 years ago, which talked about some of my experience of working in India in a sort of corporate environment.
Okay.
And I touched on what I felt was quite an interesting dynamic, which is essentially a sort of generation gap, where you've got, a large number of young Indians who've grown up in an era post 1991, for whom life has been about opportunity and abundance.
Right.
That's right.
And that, as you well know, contrasts quite significantly with the era that went before. And so I felt that across all of India's institutions, and when I say institutions, I mean the family, marriage, the workplace, and the world of brands, that there was quite significant tension being played out as that young generation comes to the fore.
Right.
And so I touched on this in my presentation. There happened to be a publisher in the audience who said, I think that would make an interesting subject for a book. And of course, your ego kicks in and you say, yeah, sure. That's me. I'll do that. I'll write that book.
Right.
And then there's that moment of realization and sheer terror when you recognize the fact that it's really going to take quite a lot of effort and time and energy to do it.
So how long did it take you?
I spent a year and a half.
A year and a half.
Yeah, really,
Okay.
on the process. And my publisher, which is Routledge, I think did a very good job in terms of forcing me into writing a very detailed, chapter by chapter synopsis of the book. And I found that was then a very helpful template in terms of, what I then did, because I'd broken it down into manageable parts.
Yeah.
I went and I interviewed 70 people for the book. And some of those are Indian millennials, so young people.
Right.
Some of them are people in the corporate world, who have responsibility for recruiting and then retaining those people in their organizations. And some of them are brand owners or people who manage brands, who again are thinking about how do we appeal to that young generation of people for whom the notion of brand loyalty is very different to that which went before.
That's
and I was
interesting, actually, like 3 perspectives to it. So
I tried to get a sort of multiplicity of views on that. And as I said to a friend of mine recently, in actual fact, there's not a lot of writing for me to do in that. In essence, I've done 70 interviews, and my job is then to sort of weave them together and to try and tease out some themes and some, perspectives that I thought, that I thought would engage a readership. And I was doing that research in 2017. It was the 70th anniversary of India's independence from the British Raj, so 70 people kind of seemed to, be a manageable number.
I think one of the main positive points about your book is it kind of gives millennials the real idea of why they kind of have so much opportunity, because a lot of the millennials that have grown up post 1991, they don't even know like how life was before that and how restricted it was before the industries were opened up. And that's why I think it would be a great read for a lot of the young people, as well as the older generation for sure, but it would give millennials maybe a better understanding of what they're living through right now.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what I've tried to do is just to shine a light on some of those differences and to sort of highlight where some of the gaps, but also to try and, be positive about where the areas of overlap and where the opportunities are. And the fact that, at times those sort of generations seem to speak different languages and have very different perspectives on the world. But one of the points that I tried to sort of tease out was the fact that you've got this real sort of sense of modernity about young India, and its use of technology, for example, and the fact that, young Indians are consuming the same content as their cousins in other parts of the world. And yet at the same time, they're actually quite beholden to tradition. They don't want to turn their back on tradition. They don't want to be outcast. They're quite keen to make sure that they belong.
Right.
And so I felt that there were some kind of interesting themes, which are in a sense quite uniquely Indian, I think.
Yeah. And you also mentioned in the excerpt about instant gratification, which is one of the things that, we see is, what most millennials want is like everything should be instantly at my doorstep. So tell us about some interesting, facts that you learned along the way about millennials, or, perspectives which we don't know about or we just don't tend to see because we're so jaded in the way we look at them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you will recognise the fact that traditionally spending in India is something which has been quite tightly controlled. There are systems that apply in terms of when and how one can spend money.
Right.
And, one of the brands that I identified, which I think is doing some interesting and quite disruptive stuff, was Pepperfry. Now, Pepperfry lets you go and buy a sofa online. Now, buying a sofa has perhaps never been a particularly radical act, but actually what Pepperfry is doing is it's putting that sort of decision-making and the ability to make purchases, quite significant purchases, in the hands of young people, whereas traditionally the buying of a sofa was tied to a whole load of other sort of societal activities which involved getting married and moving into your own home, and you didn't necessarily as an individual have control over those things because it may be that you were having an arranged marriage and the timing of that and when you were allowed to go and set up your own home was decided by somebody else. And Pepperfry comes along and says, you can have it, and you can have it on credit, and it will be with you tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that gives an immense amount of power to that young generation who now don't have to be beholden to an older generation. They don't have to wait. They can go and buy their sofa and set up their home. So it's quite powerful.
Yeah, that is. And that's quite a substantial purchase to be, to do online. So, yeah, definitely disrupting the market.
A lot of power in the hands of the young millennials. But your book speaks to more...
I'm sometimes not sure that they recognise that.
Right.
So I think actually in many ways India's millennials have kind of greater power than they necessarily recognise.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in some instances they sort of lack a confidence. They don't feel necessarily empowered, whereas in fact there is evidence to suggest that they should be.
Right. The traditional structures of family and businesses
they're very resilient.
Yeah. That's true. It is a kind of a fight between, not a fight, it's a existence between traditional and non-traditional, modern ways of existing.
I would say a tension. And I would say that that's a powerful, potentially enriching, creative tension.
Right. Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about who should pick up this book. Obviously, it covers different perspectives, the millennial perspective, maybe the brand perspective. So who is this book an ideal pickup for?
Yeah, so when I was, as I said, sort of drafting the synopsis, and Routledge were making me think quite deeply about what it was that I was going to do and who the audience was, I felt that the audience was probably outside of India. In other words, I felt that it was an opportunity for me. By that time, I'd lived in India for almost 10 years. I felt it was an opportunity to present an outsider's perspective.
Right.
And I think an outsider's perspective is potentially quite valuable because I'm sort of unencumbered, if you will, by...
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So I thought for people who are interested in India, and there's clearly a lot of interest in India outside, because it's a fast-growing, large market. Everybody wants a piece of the action.
Definitely.
So I sort of felt that the opportunity was to perhaps break down some of the myths, perhaps give a granular kind of exposition on current India and, that tipping point, if you like. One of the things that I've recognised or realised in the year since it was published is that actually there's a lot of interest within India, because I think there's something about Indians who like to know, what is it like for you being an outsider? Tell us what you've discovered.
Exactly.
Tell us,
Right.
what are we like?
Yeah.
So I've had a lot of positive response from within India about people who say, okay, so, we're interested in that. They're obviously themes which they recognise, but I think they value that outsider's, as you say, unbiased perspective.
Fantastic.
In answer to who should pick it up, everybody
should
go to
definitely
Amazon.in
pick it up.
And pick it up.
It's available on Amazon. And
if you buy it in India, you get it at 1/4 of the price of if you buy it in the UK.
That's
fantastic.
So buy it in India.
Buy it in India on Amazon.in.
Yeah.
On that note, we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back after this.
Hey everybody, welcome to another amazing, awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on all the major platforms, that's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life, for coming on board, and we'd like to thank the extended association we have with Storytel. If you work for a brand that you think would benefit from advertising on IVM, why haven't you reached out to us yet? Please do. So I wanted to announce 2 new shows we got releasing this week. The first is Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast, and the second is Beyond Cliché. Yuddha is a podcast hosted by Anirudh Kanisetti, host of Echoes of India, and Aditya Ramnathan, who hosts All Things Policy. They explore the darker, blood-splattered side of India, beyond Bollywood and school textbooks. This is military history of the subcontinent the way it was meant to be told. Stay tuned for the first episode releasing this Wednesday on the 12th. You will not be disappointed. On our second news show this week, Beyond Cliché, Almas Virani, speaker, author, and coach, starts conversations around bending gender norms and stereotypes as she interviews guests who have challenged these roles through their distinctive journey. First episode for this comes out on Thursday, the 13th of February. Again, really fun show. I think you'll like it. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus sits down with Abbas Momin, who is moving on from IVM. They discuss how Abbas started doing comedy, why he is the odd one out in his family of dentists, and his journey with IVM and what's going forward for him. This week on Simplified, the gang talk about Marudu apartments in Kerala. On The Habit Coach, Ashton takes you through 10 habits for 2020 and beyond. On IVM Likes, Abbas Madhuri and Ritika are joined by Lakshmi Krishnan, host of Litnama, to talk about their favorite pieces of literature. On Litnama, Lakshmi is joined by stand-up comedian and podcast producer Abbas Momin, who is on his farewell tour of IVM, to discuss Twitter trends, recent hashtags, and its political impact. On the Pragati podcast, Anupam Manur talks to Pawan about how India's economy can be brought back on track. On Tapri Tales, Madhuri weaves a tale around a conversation between three friends. On the Traveling Professors podcast, host Siddharth talks about B2B marketing as tribal marketing. On KBCD, Sunitra and Farad discuss if there can be one happily ever after, or if the idea keeps evolving and changing. And lastly, we'd like to wish Abbas the best of luck in the future. As you can tell, he's on a number of episodes this week, so you are definitely going to hear him. I'm sure he'll be back, and we wish him all the best in all his future endeavors. Wow, that sounds like we are writing a recommendation, but no, we really are going to miss him, and we wish him all the best. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back, guys. We still have with us Mark Hannant, author of Midnight's Grandchildren. Hey, Mark. That was a very insightful first half.
Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So before we get into any other books, let's discuss your writing process a little bit. And this is such a research-oriented book. What was the process like? Did you learn anything about writing, or, because you were a writer earlier, was this different from your writing experiences as a journalist?
Yeah, it was different. Yeah, I mean, the idea of sort of having to, write 1,000 or a couple of thousand words a day is nothing, is not alien to me, because I've traditionally done that, and I like the rhythm of doing that. One of the challenges was that I felt, having done 70 interviews, the challenge is then, how do you structure this? So there's that sort of, it's quite daunting to look at it all and think, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to structure all of this? One of the things that I recognized was the fact that, there is no internal momentum to the writing of a book. My professional life, we have clients and I have a team of people, and so every day is quite ordered and structured, and there are demands on my time, and that gives some momentum. Whereas with the book, nothing.
Right.
Unless you create it. It's a bit like running. Unless you put one foot in front of the other, you're never going to get anywhere. But I did learn that I'm very self-disciplined. When I sat down, I was able to achieve what I wanted to in the time frame that I wanted to. I took myself off to a place just north of Mumbai called Manori Bell, which I'm sure you know. Yes. Most people of a certain age in Mumbai say, yes, I remember we used to go there and hang out and have parties at weekends.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a great place. You go there at the weekend and it's quite busy with families. And I could be there during the week and I'd be the only guest there.
Yeah.
And, I could just sit and I could get 10, 12, even more hours at a stretch, run on the beach in the morning, walk on the beach in the afternoon, get some good peace and quiet. But you learn a lot about yourself, I think, when you go through that process.
It's fantastic.
The good and the bad.
Fantastic. So we're going to go on to discussing some other books now by authors that have influenced you. So the first book that we're discussing is Fish. Fish is by...
It's by Sophie Grigson and William Black.
So tell us a little bit about this book, and how did you pick up this book? How did it find you? How did you find it?
Definitely for creative people. So, yeah.
Well, it's a cookery book.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, when you said to me, pick 3 books, I sort of went and I looked at my bookshelves, which are laden down, because I've been collecting books for, 4 decades. And that includes well over 100 cookbooks. So I thought, well, I best include a cookbook in my selection. I spend my weekends cooking. I find it a great antidote to the sort of mental work that consumes my weekdays.
Okay.
I like the physical activity of food preparation, the measuring and the chopping and the mixing and the stirring. And it delivers instant gratification.
Yeah. And that's so true, because when I started my own business, that's when I realized that, sometimes when you're cooking, it's like therapy, you feel relaxed. And it's not something I would want to do every day, but definitely, it's a great way to sort of...
It's a way to unwind. But it's a
yeah.
creative way to unwind
Right.
as well.
Right.
So, food for me is like travel. I enjoy the exploration. I like going and finding new places, but I also like going back and revisiting things that I know. And Sophie Grigson's Fish book is one of those books that I often go back to. There's several things about it that I like. First of all, the name is very simple, Fish.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's evocative. And I, sort of live by the principles of less is more. So a book that's elegantly produced and called Fish very much appeals to me. It was given to me by my wife 20 years ago.
Okay.
But as you can see, when we've got a copy of it here, it's very well thumbed and it's been splattered with sauce and cooking water, which I think is a sign of a book well used.
Well used,
Definitely.
exactly.
Definitely. So is there anything in particular about this cookbook? Is that why you remember it? Other than it's a gift from your wife, obviously.
Right, it's a gift from my wife. It's also been very well used. I think people are often fearful of cooking fish. Fish is a difficult thing, people think, to cook. Actually, the reality is that it's very easy.
Right.
The principle should be, it's the KISS principle, keep it simple. Go and buy well-sourced ingredients and be careful with them.
Right.
It's not the kind of book that comes out every month. It comes out for kind of special occasions, but there are some recipes in there which are, staples, if you like, around our dining table. And the dining table is a kind of key part of our family life.
Right.
Yeah? Eating is important, and cooking and preparing and sharing food is important to us.
That's fantastic. Any particular recipes that, stand out for you in this book?
There's a fish pie in there which has been used, for 20 years.
Wow.
And, there are some variations of it, but we're purists.
Mark's
and we kind of...
fish pie.
Well,
It's the new
Sophie's
one.
fish pie. And I'm a purist. I don't go in for the notion of fusion food. I'm not a great fan of kind of mixing this with this. I think if you're going to cook Italian food, cook proper Italian food. If you're going to cook Indian food, do authentic Indian food.
Right.
Fantastic.
There is one other just sort of anecdote to that book, which is that when I was a student, I spent some time working in quite a fancy hotel.
Okay.
And I learnt to fillet a fish. I also learnt how to mix a good martini.
Wow.
But I also got given a very good piece of advice by a guy who was the head chef at the time, and he went on to have a very successful career as a sort of celebrity TV chef.
Okay.
But his advice to me as an 18-year-old was, if you want to seduce a woman, cook fish. And to an 18-year-old, that was a fantastic piece of advice, which I followed very successfully.
Very successfully. Great. So some advice there for everyone. Great. So the next book that we're moving on to is a Murakami book. This one is A Wild Sheep Chase. And I believe this book is a sequel in the Rat series, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I, in fact, have to confess, I just recently started reading Murakami, and not through my first novel yet, but well on my way. It's a very interesting world I seem to have stepped into.
I think that's exactly right. I think what you've done is stepped into a world, and it's an intriguing and, a world of strangeness and weirdness.
Yeah.
But if you go with it, I think you may find that it opens up more worlds to you, and I think you may find that there's lots for you to go and explore in the sort of surrealistic, sometimes magical realism of Haruki Murakami.
Yeah.
Sadly, I can't read Japanese, so I have to read it in the
English
translation. Yeah, but I was first introduced to Murakami, and the first book of his that I read was A Wild Sheep Chase about 30 years ago, and I've then subsequently read, I think, pretty much all of his fiction and some of his non-fiction. Mm-hmm. And there are some common themes, if you like, that appear in his writing. They almost always involve some sort of journey. Yeah. And that journey is typically both physical and metaphysical in nature. So it's a voyage, if you like, of internal discovery and a search for meaning, as well as a real world search.
Yeah.
I mean, in the case of A Wild Sheep Chase, as the name suggests, it's a search for a sheep.
Right.
But, at the same time, it's a quest for meaning and closure on the part of the narrator.
Right. So, why this story in particular? Why is this book, the Murakami book that you like the best?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the Murakami book that I like the best. I think, there were perhaps others, perhaps more recent ones. So he published a book which was translated into English last year called Killing Commendatore,
okay.
Which, is actually a much bigger, longer novel. And one of the things that I like about Murakami is a very sort of slow storytelling style.
Right.
Yeah? The action doesn't happen quickly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of just average day-to-day stuff that goes on in his novels, and it allows you to...
It's also because you, I guess, have to read between the lines in most of his books, there is a hidden thought, which is what I think he allows you to stress on while, narrating the story. So it's more gradual.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think there are lots of sort of hidden meanings.
Yeah.
I think in a sense, he allows the reader to make their own interpretation of what's going on. And I often find, as you suggest, that I go back and I reread paragraphs.
Yeah.
And that's for two reasons. One of which I just think bear in mind that, this has been translated from Japanese into English, but his way with words is just masterful. His ability to put together a paragraph and to express a huge amount in a short space with immense kind of colour and to push the story forward, I think is majestic. And so I sometimes just go back because I'm wowed by the storytelling. But you're right, and there's also typically other stuff that you recognise. And one of the reasons why I chose Murakami, and A Wild Cheap Chase was the first that I read, and I must have read it perhaps 4 or 5 times over the last 3 decades. It's a book that I've gone back to, and there are things in it which you then see in a different light. So without giving away too much of the book, there is a suicide in the story, and when I read that as a young man in my early 20s, I had no experience of suicide. Clearly, sitting here now, I haven't attempted and been successful with suicide, but I have had in my life a friend who killed themselves, and I was in a relationship with a woman who tried to do so. So, you then bring that experience to the novel, and then when you reread it, you come at it with a different experience, and you see it through a different lens, and you read different things into it. So, he's an author that I find I can go back to, and over time, as I've matured and my sense of the world has expanded, you read different things into him.
Fantastic. It's, I think, one of the marks of great literature is when you go back and you reread a book and it speaks to you completely differently because of your own perspective. I think Murakami is, reading his books gives me like a casual insight into Japanese culture, which is always so fascinating because it's kind of so alien from anything we've probably experienced over here.
Very resilient. That's what's beautiful about him. It's just all over his books and how focused he was. It's just beautiful.
I think you're right. I think one of the things that he's been very successful at doing is, if you like, giving an insight or window into Japanese culture, which for many of us, for many other Asians, is something which is a bit alien and we don't necessarily understand. And I think he presents that in a way which is quite westernized. Lots of his influences are Western authors. And, his narrative style, his storytelling style is perhaps more Western than Japanese. But what he's doing at the same time is giving you little kind of insights and explanations of bits of Japanese culture.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I love
so
it.
he works on lots of different levels. And as I say, I kind of keep returning to him. Yeah, he's very high in my sort of list of favourite authors. But there's some weird stuff that goes on in his... There's some weird stuff that kind of goes on in his stories.
But you kind of just got to go along for the ride, I guess for me, it's like I'm still starting to read, but we've discussed a few of his books before. In fact, you mentioned you're a runner. Have you read his book on running as well?
Actually, I haven't. That's one of the... So I've been less sort of taken by his non-fiction stuff.
Right.
I mean, I know of it, but it's not something that I've read. It's on my list, but it's never quite sort of bubbled to the top. But you're right. Yeah, he's a much more accomplished runner than I am.
Yeah, he actually speaks about how running and writing are pretty similar in terms of a habit and how he kind of manages both effectively.
And how he could think the best when he was running. So it used to actually put him in that, writing space when he used to run. So
yeah, I mean, I find exactly the same. I mean, the fact that, you've got whatever your distance is, but, you've got a period of time where essentially the only thing that you're going to do is put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
And if you're doing that in somewhere like Joggers Park, where you don't have to worry about falling over, broken pavements, then you can just, the mind is free. And so you can think about, how am I going to find a resolution to that? Or, what is my theme going to be in this? Or solve other of life's great problems, like what to cook for dinner.
Right. Great. And the last book that we're going to discuss is The Best of A. Wainwright.
Yeah. Alfred Wainwright was an interesting character. He wrote a series of books. When I say wrote, he wrote and illustrated a series of 7 books, which are called A Pictorial Guide to the Lakeland Fells.
Okay.
Lakeland, or the Lake District, is a national park in the northwest of England. And I spent some of my childhood living there. and exploring some of those mountains. Anyway, this guy whose day job was to be the treasurer of the borough council spent his spare time climbing the mountains of this beautiful national park. The reality was that he was doing that in order to escape what was a very unhappy marriage. But the result of it, and he spent 13 years writing and drawing a comprehensive guide to 214 mountains. And you've got ascents and descents, every possible angle, right?
Wow.
So they're really practical and precise guide, and they're beautifully hand-drawn. Anyway, so I have a collection of all 7 books. You know, I'm limited for space in Bombay. So I keep this book, which is the best of Wainwright, which is written by a guy called, or curated, I guess, by a guy called Hunter Davis, who also is somebody who has a great affinity for that part of the world. And so I keep that with me. I also have a map of the region, and I can sort of either review walks and relive past glories, if you will, or also plan my next excursion.
Amazing.
And, you know, it's a complete antithesis of my life in Mumbai. You know, so I live here in a mega city, and I love that, and I thrive on being in a city and all of that offers. But, you know, sometimes you need to escape, and that is my escape. I'm very fortunate because I've just come back. We've been in England over the Christmas period, and I managed to climb a few mountains in that time.
Oh, wow, fantastic.
Yeah, mountains.
And London and Christmas is unbeatable. Great. So it was fantastic having you on our show. Where can we find you online? You mentioned you're on LinkedIn. Can your readers reach out to you on LinkedIn?
I'd love for people to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I do have a Twitter account, but it doesn't get used very much. And the producer here said, was I on Instagram? And I'm sadly not. My 2 children are, but that's something which I think rather passed me by. But yeah, so in terms of social media, LinkedIn is the place where I feel comfortable and I'm most active.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
So a big thank you, Mark, for being on our show. We'd love to have you again. Possibly when your next book is out, we'd love to have you before the book comes and do a whole launch around it.
Yeah, I don't have any intentions either of doing another Bollywood film or of writing another book. So we may not meet again in these circumstances, but I'm sure our paths will cross somewhere else. But thank you very much for the invitation and the thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much.
And a big thank you to all our listeners. You can follow the Open Library Project on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for latest updates on our events. And stay tuned for the next Paperback podcast on IVM Podcasts. Happy reading. You can follow IVM Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at IVM Podcasts. Listen to Paperback on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
How many times have you motivated yourself to improve your sleep, or lose weight, or be more productive? How many times have you failed? Hi, my name is Ashton Doctor. Tune into my show, The Habit Coach Podcast, where we focus on creating small, tiny habits to improve your life instead of those big, impossible tasks. So make listening to me a habit every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com or on your favorite podcasting app.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, the Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.